Labas, Tomai, ir girdimus.
Taip, puikiai, ačiū.
Gerai, puiku. Man atrodo, visi susirinko. Galvoju, ar duris reikia uždaryti ar ne? Gal kas nors galėtumėt pagelbėt. Tai sveiki.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this round table here in this hall and those who joined us online with the International Organization for Migration, the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees, and the World Health Organization. We are organizing a roundtable discussion. Are there any alternatives to detention, standards, health implications, and practices? We had 53 participants registered for this roundtable. This is a surprising number, which shows that the topic is really relevant that we have to discuss. On our agenda, we have welcome remarks by Tomas Vitosis, Chair of the Committee on Human Rights, and the representative of organizations, the co-organizers of this roundtable discussion. And then the keynote speeches. If the participants are willing to share their insights and experience, please kindly raise your hand. So this is my invitation. Thank you once again. And I would like to give the floor to the chair of the committee. Lithuania was able to successfully manage the crisis of instrumentalized migration, otherwise referred to as a hybrid attack. This and similar statements have been voiced in the public space for several months now. First, these are the claims of the politicians who were responsible for managing the crisis. However, if you take a closer look, the reality does not seem to be so impressive. Every day, we still have about 100 persons illegally trying to cross the Lithuanian-Belarusian border being pushed back. There are doubts as to whether there is a real possibility of applying for asylum in Lithuania at all. Clear criteria for applying for asylum by persons who cross the border illegally are not identified, and the number of asylum applications at border checkpoints or diplomatic missions remains minimal, or sometimes non-existent at all. Finally, this summer, the Court of Justice of the European Union essentially disapproved of the migration management measures taken in Lithuania, as they denied the right to lodge an asylum application enshrined in European Union documents. Interestingly, the Court of Justice of the European Union stated clearly that the mere fact that an asylum seeker enters the territory of a member state illegally does not constitute a sufficient grounds for his or her detention. So is this a successful management of the migration crisis? I'm deeply convinced that the crisis of instrumentalized migration in Lithuania had two important components, namely national security and human rights. An effective and sustainable solution to the crisis could only be achieved by combining these two elements, as they complement and reinforce rather than contradict each other. Unfortunately, the human rights component in Lithuania has been ignored, while the crisis of instrumentalized migration has been dealt with strictly from the standpoint of security. Statistics is to prove my claim. Since the onset of the instrumentalized migration crisis, only 169 people have been granted asylum, i.e. 5% of all asylum applications lodged. 637 foreign nationals have been voluntarily returned to their countries of origin, and 2,295 foreigners have left their accommodations as soon as they were granted freedom of limited mobility. At the head of the migration crisis, the politicians who undertook to address the crisis often argued that immigrants entering Lithuania must be accommodated by restricting their freedom of movement, because in this way we protect not only ourselves but also Europe as a whole. Well, we have achieved an impressive result, we may say. We have kept people confined for a year in conditions that have been identified by both international and national authorities as being equivalent to torture and inhumane degrading treatment, and the result equals the initial cause. On behalf of the Committee on Human Rights, I would like to welcome the roundtable. Are there any alternatives to detention, standards, health implications and practices, the speakers and the audience? Thank you for initiating a dialogue which can help us to look and critically assess what has already been done and also reflect on what we could do differently should the crisis of instrumentalized migration strike again. After all, it is not for nothing that they say a wise man learns from others and a fool from his own mistakes. Thank you for today's initiative. I wish you a meaningful and productive event, and I regret that I cannot join you live today due to personal circumstances. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for describing the situation and the statistics and the reality that we are in today. And now I would like to give the floor to Ingrida Zurlytė, head of the World Health Organization office in Lithuania. Good morning, honorable members of the Seimas, participants of the event, speakers, all who have come to the Seimas or have joined us online via the Seimas YouTube platform. Dear colleagues, I congratulate you on behalf of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees mission to the Nordic and Baltic states, the Office of the International Organization for Migration in Lithuania, and the Office of the World Health Organization in Lithuania. First of all, we would like to thank the Committee on Human Rights of the Seimas of the Republic of Lithuania, in particular Tomas Raskevičius, chair of the committee, and Rūta Ragaliauskienė, for their leadership and close cooperation in organizing this round-table discussion. In the summer of 2021, Lithuania was confronted with an exceptional situation and major challenges related to the increase in the number of irregular arrivals from Belarus to Lithuania. Strict restrictions were imposed on the Lithuanian-Belarusian border, and more than 4,000 persons were placed in long-term detention, including children. Such actions of Lithuania were criticized by international organizations, examined and evaluated by international courts. Continuous monitoring was carried out in contribution to the improvement of detention conditions, and the reduction of negative impacts was made by Lithuanian municipal, national, as well as international institutions and NGOs. More than 1 year ago, we faced various tests, various stages of management of the situation were experienced. Many things were understood and learned, but still a lot needs to be done and can be done. We understand that this event is one of the steps in our way forward. What we very much hope that in the light of the experience gained, today's reports and debates will be useful and will allow us to rethink the lessons of the 21-22 emergency situation and find solutions to manage migration, while at the same time meeting human rights and international law standards. On behalf of all the United Nations agencies in Lithuania, I want to assure you that we are in Lithuania, we are with Lithuania and for Lithuania. We are ready to continue to contribute fully to ensuring that the situation of refugees and migrants in Lithuania is in line with humanistic and human rights provisions, and that no one is left behind. We are confident that together we can achieve this. I wish good luck to everyone.
Ingrida,
Thank you, Madam Ingrida, for your welcome address. And without further ado, I'd like to say that we're going to move to the presentation part. The first presentation will echo the words from the welcome remarks about the accommodation conditions for asylum seekers and refugees. So let me give the floor to Mr. Vladimir Sinovas, who is a legal advisor for UNHCR representation for Nordic and Baltic countries. Mr. Sinovas is going to speak about accommodation of asylum seekers, measures alternative to detention, and detention in line with the international and EU standards. Mr. Sinov, please take the floor once you are ready. Thank you. I'd like to start from the very beginning, from the very basics. As the colleagues say, back to the basics. There are three key imperatives that are related to the requirements that allow to define how countries should receive and welcome people who come to their territory and ask for asylum. So that's the right to asylum that has been established both in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as well as in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. Another requirement is the non-imposition of penalties for entering or being on the territory without authorization. This is a very popular provision, but I'd like to note that it was established in the Refugee Convention. So the countries have to allow entry for people who do not have the authorization. There is yet another requirement, that is the right to freedom and personal security that is enshrined in the European Human Rights Convention, the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, and the Reception Conditions Directive. These are the key documents that provide for the conditions for asylum seekers and for those people who come to the country until they are waiting for their applications for refugee status to be processed. What countries have to ensure is open, humane, and dignified reception and other conditions. These are the key words, and these are open, humane, and dignified. What do these words mean? They mean that either a person lives in a community or in the collective reception accommodation center, but has the opportunity to leave the facilities, to go to another town or city to meet lawyers, that the children of those people can attend schools, that all those people have access to social and other services, which means that those people have access to normal living conditions. I do understand that all the centers have their own requirements, but in fact, the main thing is that such people are free to live their life. These conditions have been established in the EU rights. Here you see the decision taken by the European Court of Justice of the European Union, which means that those conditions of normal accommodation of applicants for international protection are entitled in collective accommodation centers. Nevertheless, freedom of movement is not an absolute freedom. Therefore, the country, according to the international law, has the right to control and manage the arrival of such people to their territory. And in the practice of various countries, there are quite a lot of restrictions. Restrictions depend on the individual circumstances and other circumstances. However, such restrictions do not necessarily equal to detention. Of course, detention is a restriction of freedom, but a restriction of freedom is the measure of last resort. The blue and red colors mean the restrictions which, because of their intensity, are equal to detention. But the state has a wide spectrum of other measures to achieve a legal outcome, that is, to ensure that a person is waiting for the decision, participates in the asylum procedures. So the state can apply other restrictions which are not equal to detention. In Lithuanian, we call them alternative measures to detention, and these measures are the measures that allow asylum seekers to live in the community subject to certain conditions and restrictions on their freedom of movement. For example, such as reporting of their place of residence. And I'm not going to enumerate all these things because I will leave this question for my colleagues. There is yet another important aspect, especially in the context of Lithuania, is that alternative to detention should not be used as alternative forms of detention, which means, irrespective of the definition of detention in the national law, it is possible that under the national law, some types of accommodation are not considered as detention, but according to international law, and are considered as detention. So I will look into those aspects further, but still, I will start with the guidelines. I see that you already have our book. These are the guidelines on the alternatives to detention. This publication provides for the definition of detention. You might wonder why I am talking about our guidelines rather than the guidelines of the international organizations. When we prepared this publication, we took the decisions of the European Court. We looked at the international law. So according to our guidelines, detention refers to the deprivation of liberty or confinement in a closed place which an asylum seeker is not permitted to leave at will, including, though not limited to, prison or purpose-built detention, closed reception, or holding centers or facilities. European Court of Human Rights also applies certain criteria in deciding whether one or another situation is equal to detention. According to the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, it does not matter how a certain place is called under the national law. According to the Court of Human Rights, the difference between deprivation and restriction of liberty is one of degree or intensity, or not one of nature or substance. So, if the person's freedom to movement is restricted, it may be considered as detention. According to the case law of European Court of Justice, the detention is very clearly defined. Here you see only one of the cases. There are many more of them. I think that this legal material is very important for Lithuania because in those cases, the court has ruled out what detention is under the European Union law. According to the EU law, the detention of an applicant constitutes a coercive measure that deprives that applicant of his or her freedom of movement and isolates him or her from the rest of the population by requiring him or her to remain permanently within a restricted and closed perimeter. It is very important for us to understand what detention means, because if a person is detained, we have to look at all the international laws and the provisions under which we have to ensure certain conditions for a person detained. It is obvious that detention per se is not banned under the international law.
Countries have the right to control the entry of foreign nationals, but international law prohibits unlawful and arbitrary detention. Therefore, every time when a person is detained, we have to ask ourselves if this detention is lawful or whether or not it is arbitrary. According to the EU law, detention has to be lawful, and this lawfulness is assessed according to two criteria. First of all, any detention must be provided for and carried out in accordance with national law. It is insufficient to adopt the law. Detention laws must comply with quality criteria. First of all, the principle of legal certainty. There is a number of decisions of the European Court of Human Rights which discuss the law. The law and its legal consequences must be foreseeable, and the law must be predictable, precise, and accessible. And the person has to be able to understand this law in a certain situation and what is the duration of a possible detention and what are the possibilities for redress. And one of the requirements of that is individual formal decision or decision on an individual basis for detention, where an individual situation is being assessed and the grounds are established for detention. International law prohibits unlawful detention and arbitrary detention. Arbitrariness involves not only unlawfulness but also inadequacy. In order to protect against arbitrariness, any detention must be necessary on an individual case basis, justified by individual circumstances, and proportionate to a legitimate aim. Therefore, proportionality and necessity is assessed. And in doing this, it is important to consider special needs, because asylum seekers might include children, elderly people, pregnant women, persons who have been subjected to torture or other forms of serious psychological and physical sexual violence. And every time the decision is made, we have to answer a question whether it is necessary and proportionate to detain a person, taking into consideration his or her special needs. And therefore, alternative to detention measures are very necessary here. The duration of detention. So this is a criterion to assess and evaluate whether the detention is arbitrary, especially when it is indefinite or disproportionately long. And we can see that it is very difficult for countries to prove that that detention is lawful when the duration of detention is long-term. There are a lot of court cases where asylum seekers are detained for a short period, for a shorter period. So the duration of detention actually is the factor for winning or losing the case in the European Court for Human Rights. Asylum seekers should not be detained for longer than necessary where the circumstances justifying detention no longer apply. The asylum seeker shall be released immediately. And the best practice is when countries define maximum duration of detention in their legislation. Speaking about the procedural guarantees, we know that every person needs to be informed in the language comprehensible to him or to her on the time limits of detention, on his or her rights and forms of redress. The decision has to be taken in writing, and it should include the factual circumstances for detaining a person. When a person is detained without a decision to detain, it becomes a problematic situation. The detention has to be justified on case-to-case basis. Granting a state-guaranteed legal aid is also one of the procedural guarantees. Judicial review of detention is also included into these guarantees. This is an absolute right according to the European Convention on Human Rights. And our agency underlines the importance of access to the asylum procedure. It means that every person detained or who enters a country has to have the right to access to get the access to the asylum procedure. Speaking about the conditions of detention, we can speak indefinitely about them because there are many sources that discuss the conditions of detention centers. I will name the basic ones. Officially designated detention centers should be officially designated places of detention with appropriate rules. People have to be ensured appropriate material conditions. Clothing, food should be in line with the requirements for such places. Detention should not be a criminal sanction because very often detention centers remind of prisons, but they should not be considered as prisons. The European Court of Human Rights states that people who seek asylum are seeking protection and they should not be confined in places resembling prisons. Standards of personal behavior, access to United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees, NGOs and legal advisors, prevention of violence, gender-related violence, and we have to ensure appropriate response to situations and incidents of violence. According to the European Court on Human Rights, inadequate detention conditions are one of the indications of arbitrary detention. So, adequate or inadequate conditions can have legal implications because asylum seekers can claim in court that their detention was arbitrary because the detention conditions were inadequate. Therefore, it is necessary to ensure adequate detention conditions in this respect too. And the last aspect that I wanted to discuss is the border procedure. I have described the beautiful conditions. We all understand what needs to be ensured. But for example, if 4,000 people enter a country in several months, it becomes a challenge to ensure all the appropriate conditions and requirements. According to our official positions and documents, we believe that border procedure, Lithuania applied border procedure in summer 2021. It is possible. However, it has to comply with the requirements of international law. Appropriate border procedure can help to address other challenges and problems that Lithuania faces or other countries face. We agree that restrictions of movement are possible during the border procedure. And detention in certain cases may be lawful during the border procedure. However, we have to speak about the intensity and the scale of detention. For example, during the primary screening registration, the detention can be possible. Or for example, when assessing the identity, but full detention. If, for example, the claim for asylum is ungrounded, a person can be detained for several weeks. And this is the standard in the Asylum Procedures Directive. So 4 weeks is the maximum period for detention. The European Court of Human Rights has declared that after 4 weeks, a state can have the right to apply other measures, restrictive measures. For example, if a person is detained for 4 weeks, and later on, the detention is no longer applied, but he or she is restricted from leaving one or another area. So this would be absolutely legal according to the EU law. Well, I'm running out of time, so the last aspect is of a procedural nature. A country could use measures first to ensure the right to freedom and, on the other hand, to safeguard its national security. So the process of asylum and its management is very important. The triage, it is necessary to ensure there are three lanes for investigating asylum applications. So you have already, Chairman has already mentioned that a number of people were already given asylum status. It means that they were from countries whose refugees are granted asylum status. So we are recommending that these processes should be speeded up for people coming from the same countries. The second lane should go to unfounded claims, and the third lane for complex cases. So this would be one of the ways to successfully manage the flows, illegal entry flows.
Kad ten mačiau laikrodį stebėjai.
Thank you, Mr. Vladimiras. I saw you watching the time, so I'm very happy that you finished your presentation on time. You have talked rather broadly, and you have covered both the principles, the detention concept, the risks, and the basis for detention. You also mentioned the vulnerable groups and the proportionality of the sanctions imposed and the principles that are undertaken in Lithuania. Well, you were right when you mentioned that Lithuania faces quite a few challenges when the number of migrants increases. And I see that there are people who want to ask a question to Mr. Vladimir Sinovas, and Mr. Vladimir will be ask you to answer the question. Good morning. I am from the Refugee Registration Center, and first and foremost, I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers for the timely conference. I would also like to thank Mr. Vladimir Sinovas for his very extensive presentation. I have one question, and having heard your answer, I will have one more remark. Do you think that alternatives to detention are effective in Lithuania? If you think that they are effective or not effective, or what were the reasons for that? Thank you. I think that this is a key question. When it comes to assessing effectiveness, it is a rather difficult question. I remember when we talked some years ago, and we talked about the number of the people who have moved away from Lithuania. And as far as I remember, the percentage was 30%. At that time, there was a pilot project that was initiated partly by our organization when the Lithuanian Caritas also provided accommodation for refugees in communities in various Lithuanian towns and cities. And I think that at that time, the number of people who have left Lithuania was equal to 3%. So when it comes to efficiency, I see three criteria for assessing efficiency. So first and foremost, the number of people who have withdrawn from Lithuania, who have moved from Lithuania, but then we have to answer the question why they have left Lithuania. We have to answer the questions with regard to the quality of detention alternatives. If such detention alternatives are not able to ensure the most important needs of the person, or when there is not enough, let's say, effort put into various cases. So I believe that we have to ensure that people remain in Lithuania and that they comply with all the requirements. Thank you for your answer. About the project that you have mentioned that was held some few years ago, people who participated in the project were very carefully selected. Therefore, the degree, the rate of their withdrawal was rather low. I agree with you when you say that a more detailed description of border procedures in Lithuanian legislation would be a very good step forward. Now, when it comes to the efficiency of all the procedures, maybe we should look into prioritizing asylum seekers And if we prioritize, let's say, more vulnerable people, I think the process itself would be more efficient. During the border procedures, we also try to assess the risk of absconding. Therefore, Lithuania also has to assess the risk of absconding in order to prioritize the applications for asylum, because the state has to ensure that it uses all its resources effectively as well. That's why I think, as it has been mentioned, we have to ensure the efficiency of the processing of asylum applications. Maybe we should also review the list of alternatives to detention. Because now when we try to assess whether our procedures were effective, we look through the prism of the rate of absconding. And our figures are rather high, which means that the efficiency of alternatives to detention is rather low. Thank you.
Ačiū, Aleksandrai.
Thank you, Alexandras. Yes, it seems that it is not only important to say what our criteria is, but it is also important to take into account the administration resources that we have to upscale our efforts, because our institutions are not ready to the loads of work. Moreover, we also have to review our alternatives to detention, because we do have to balance security, human rights, and we have to find ways how to administer all these things and to check whether our efforts yield results. So thank you once again. And let me introduce to you the representative of the World Health Organization, Mr. Suri Joshuputumparambe, who is the head of the WHO Collaborating Center on Migration and Health Data and Evidence from the Department of Women's and Children's Health at Uppsala University. He's going to speak about health challenges of immigration detention. The floor is yours, Mr.
Thank you, Vitosis. Good morning, everybody. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be here in Lithuania again. Thanks a lot to Ingrida, the WHO country office representative here in Lithuania, for inviting me, and also for the Committee on Human Rights at the Lithuanian Parliament. I think it's a great honor to be here, but also I'm very happy to see that I visited Lithuania last November to do an assessment and see how things are proceeding. I've been working with detention for more than a decade now, and it's seldom that you see countries who are championing the cause and have an open discussion, and Lithuania is a shining example. So thanks a lot for the invitation. I am from Uppsala University, teaching global health and migration, and I'm now here in the position as the head of the WHO Collaborating Center on Migration Health, Data and Evidence at Uppsala University. The talk or the presentation I'm going to give now is quite a lot based on this guidance which we published March this year. I have a few copies with Ingrida. Unfortunately, I couldn't carry more, but it's also available online, which you can freely download. So what we are trying to do in this guidance is actually talk about the evidence overview that is present when it comes to health, both in detention, but also outside detention, in so-called alternatives to detention. So previously, my colleague from UNHCR discussed the legal background and the conditions, where I will try to put a human face to the conditions and the discussions we heard before, see how it will actually affect the individual who will be in detention. So most of us know the backgrounds, but I will briefly go through a few of these because this is connected to the health outcomes. I'm not going to quote the legal basis for this, but this, to me, I'm not a legal expert, so to this is how I define and the conditions for detention in plain English. So basically, there are 4 reasons why an individual is detained, mainly within Europe, but also in other Western countries, to establish the identity, which often happens at the border. Usually, not always, this is often of shorter duration. And some countries also use the argument of to maintain public security. This is not an argument that is used quite often, but it is still used. And as we heard before, to prevent the absconding or the risk of absconding. And the final criteria, which is quite often used in many European countries, EU countries actually, to be correct, it's actually to ensure that the individual was not cooperating, so detaining him or her will actually help them to cooperate with the deportation procedures. Now, we have heard a bit about automatic detention, and what I mean is that, as we heard from the speaker from UNHCR, we have to have a thorough legal process on who should be detained or not detained, and there are legal bases for that. But what we see in the evidence, what we have seen, and also the countries have done in most often is that it's done on individual basis. It's rather done, let's say, on a blanket criteria. You're from one particular context, one particular situation, or you came through a particular kind of route. It seems to be that there is a lack of individual assessment of an individual's requirement to be detained based on the 4 conditions mentioned before. So that's why I called it an automatic detention. And then, as we heard before, it's supposed to be used as a last resort, but evidence clearly shows that the use of detention is increasing. The amount of financial resources put into that and the capacity across the globe, it's increasing. And we also heard that the facilities should be different. It should not be in a prison. But I have visited various places in various countries. And when you look at the title of this center where they're detained, of course, it's not called a prison. I've seen places which were used as prison, and instead of now criminals being detained there, migrants are put there. There is 2 arguments here. One is the legal argument. The other one is the humane argument. So if it's not a necessarily crime to cross a border, then why am I put in a facility that looks like a prison? I've visited places where there are big structures which is guarded by big dogs. I've visited places where detention is in a faraway island and there's only one small bridge connecting to that. I visited place which looks like prison with electrocuted wires around that. And I visited places which looks like a hostel that is locked up. So the structures and how it looks like it varies, and which has a great impact on health, mainly mental health. This is just an example. I'm not going to go through it. Based on the various criteria I explained before, this is in the document I showed you before. There are various forms of detention. For example, in Netherlands, you have border detention, which happens at the border, mainly at the airport and other places. That is when an individual comes in, you have to verify the identity, and then you are detained, or for direct deportation. When there is a person who is staying in the country who has not left the country based on the rules and regulations, then you might also be detained there, which often goes to territorial detention. And there are various criteria like that. Now, I'm here to talk about health, and I'm not going to go through all the details. I'll try to pick a few of these and explain a few of these sort of key arguments I cited here. Again, all of this you can find in the report I was showing you before. So there is the big question about overall health, and one thing I just want to make clear, detention impacts health negatively. No question on that. And that's also why when we discuss these issues, we often talk about mitigate the impact of detention on health. because you cannot prevent, because it's going to harm your health. So what we can do is to reduce the impact. And it's also often interesting, like, I mean, if detention is harming the health of the migrants who are in that, why do we talk about health in detention? Why can't we just stop it? To me, that would be the ideal world, but the reality looks a bit different. So while it's very important that we discuss and promote alternatives to detention, it's equally, if not more, important to discuss the conditions in detention which severely negatively impact the health of immigrants in the detention. Because with not discussing that, to me, it's an unethical question, because we talk about how we can prevent it, but completely ignore the ones who are in there. So research across worldwide shows that there is a low quality of life. Quality of life is a bigger concept than health, which encompasses social health, environmental health, and a lot of other aspects. It's mainly connected to your surroundings where you live and work. So it showed that there is low quality of life once you're detained in detention. Quality is not just about the room you live in or the toilets you have access to, but it's much bigger, which encompasses mental health and physical health as well. So that's poor. And the main risk factor, not a surprise in any sense, it's the immigration detention environment. And I'm talking about the environment because it's not just the physical conditions, it's not just the building, it's the staff, it's the attitude, it's the language barrier, it's a lot of all those things combined. That is the biggest factor that is connected to poor mental health. If you look at communicable diseases, there is limited evidence, but the evidence that exists actually shows that there is relatively high prevalence of HIV and TB, tuberculosis, in the detained population. But the thing we need to keep in mind is that this is not that high when you compare the same prevalence with the migrant population outside detention or from their particular country of origin. And as some of us might know, tuberculosis is often known as a poor man's disease, because tuberculosis is mainly caused by poor living conditions, to crowded conditions, unhygienic conditions. So to me, it's not a surprise. One more thing we need to note is that a lot of the evidence actually presented in this report, and that is published, it's actually from, let's say, from Northern Europe, from UK, from US, from Australia. Their host population already have a lower prevalence of HIV and TB. And then if there is a migrant coming in, then of course increase the proportion. And it looks a bit different in other parts of the world, so you need to sort of adjust that to the context. And of course, migrants at a high risk of communicable diseases because they live in crowded conditions in detentions. And NCDs, sorry for using abbreviations, NCDs, non-communicable diseases. There isn't much evidence on that, but limited evidence on injuries and traumas, depending on where the detention happens. If it happens on some kind of borders, risk of higher injuries of trauma. And of course, these are individuals. They would have NCDs like diabetes and high blood pressure and other things, but there is limited evidence. Mental health, this is the one area where there is a lot of evidence present. And it clearly shows that it's actually harmful for the health of detainees. The point I want to highlight for mental health is that, because the colleague from UNHCR mentioned the duration, and it's clearly stated that the duration of detention, the longer the duration, more the mental health distress. So the longer you are being detained, higher the mental distress you have. I can show you an example. So this is a scatter plot. We don't have to look into the details, but what it shows that on the y-axis, you have a psychological domain score. For easier discussion, let's call it as mental health. In the x-axis, that is the lower axis, you have the number of days where you're detained. So if you look at the green line, you see a downward trend. It means as the number of days increase, there is lower or poorer mental health. What I would also like you to notice is the initial part, the first 30, 40 days where there's an up and down, which is quite normal in nature in the sense that once an individual is detained, you still have hope. This is temporary, I might be released soon, which has a limited impact on the mental health. But as time goes by, the level of hope reduces and then the poor mental health increases. So duration of detention is one of the key factors. And that is also why the decisions to detain an individual has to be reviewed regularly and the duration has to be reduced as much as possible. If we go back to the health conditions, most commonly reported conditions are depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, and there are studies which actually compares mental health issues between prisoners and detainees, and some studies find similar rates, some studies actually find higher rates among detained migrants. What are the things that cause mental health? Uncertainty. I don't know how long I'll be detained. I don't know if I'll be deported back to a EU country based on the Dublin regulation, or would I be deported back to a so-called home country? I've met individuals living in, for example, in Sweden for 14, 15 years, and then somehow they got in a control and they were detained and said, you'll be sent back to the home country. And the question is, like, what is home? And what is uncertainty there? And then there is, of course, language barriers. And that is something we often discuss. But in detention, it's a bit different because, see, you get a decision on your deportation. Let's say that's 10 pages. And you when ask for translation, the staff or someone else might say that, yeah, this says that you need to leave the country. That's in 2 sentences or 3 sentences. But the document is 10 pages. And then that's where the mistrust starts. But this is a big document. You're just saying that I need to leave the country. So language barriers, of course, prevents you from getting information, but also it contributes to mistrust. And of course, because I am locked up and often in a prison-like structure, why am I treated like a criminal? I have not committed any crime, a feeling of injustice. All those things and various other elements contribute to poor mental health. If you look at the health of women and children, there is limited evidence, but evidence that exists shows that women exhibit greater depression than detained men. Pregnant women in some cases have missed their appointments with their midwives and have received limited nutrition and also associated with breastfeeding. This is connected to the restricted nature within detention and the movement that is restricted. So it restricts the access to healthcare. And for children, actually the healthcare impact is quite huge. There are countries which have no duration of detention at all, which like unlimited duration. And studies from there shows that actually the impact on their mental health is actually 3 to 9 times higher than if they were not detained. And there is also evidence showing that the cognitive development has been severely impacted for them. Healthcare, there's a lack of trust because healthcare staff technically are part of the government. It's the government who is detaining me. Why should I trust the healthcare staff? And of course, there is communication barrier. And there is also saying that if I tell my health conditions to this nurse or to this doctor, is that going to affect my asylum application? Are they going to give the information to the police or to the migration authorities? And of course, there is limited availability of healthcare providers and also the cultural competence. And it's often not necessarily need-based, it's rather basic healthcare they have access to. Now, I present the challenges, and I would also briefly like to mention the solutions, if I may, when we have a bit of time. So what we use here is the so-called Ottawa Charter. This was used for health promotion. This is from WHO since 1986. What it does is that it gives you 5 areas where we could work. So we have healthy policies, which means every policy has to think about health of the individuals in the system. And then we also have an area called supportive environments, community action, personal skills, and appropriate health services. I'll show you a bit later how we can work with this. The key part I want to talk about, because we often talk about migrants in detention, but I would say that it's also equally, if not more important, to talk about staff working in detention, because they are the ones who are providing care to the immigrants in detention. Based on my research and based on my country visits I've done so far, if the staff does not have enough support, if they're not able to do their job properly, it doesn't matter how much ever we try to improve the physical standards. A cage is still a cage, even if it's made of gold. It's the individuals that interact with the migrants that create the humane nature, which has a significant impact on the mental health part. So then we have various actors and they have various roles: advocate, enable, mediate. Probably NGOs and others might be more on advocate and mediating. The state actors and healthcare providers might be on enabling. Various roles can be chosen. So these are the 5 areas we saw before. I'm just going to pick a few here. Just to be clear, I'm not going to talk about the healthy policies because the healthy policy is not to detain people. But I'm going to talk about what happens in detention. But also just to keep in mind, alternate detention, as we heard before, and we'll hear further, I'm not going to discuss it more, that is actually a healthy policy. Just to keep in mind, when we talk about alternative to detention, we need to use engagement-based alternatives. That means you're not forcing an individual to be, taking their passports or asking them to invest or put bail of a huge amount of money, but rather promoting engagement and cooperation so that the effect is there. Because we had a question on how effective it is, depending on how we measure it. So the supportive environment, it's basically a summary of what we discussed so far. Avoid prison-like characteristics. So it's not enough to that we are not using a prison, but prison-like characteristics. It could be a metal door, it could be barbed wires, it could be staff dressed as guards with guns. So those kind of characteristics should be avoided. And detention is already a restricted environment. It's good if we can avoid further restrictions in detention, because there are countries who are detaining people. In there, they say that you only have access to the open courtyard like for 2 hours a day. I mean, there is a big barbed wire, there is a set of guards looking at the detention center after that, but why do we need to have further restrictions, which actually negatively impact the health of immigrants in detention? And provide meaningful activities, because these are adults locked up throughout the day, 24/7. Provide meaningful activities. It could be anything from a carom or a billiard game to having something to do with yoga or painting or whatever, just to help them to cope with the stress a little bit. They will still be stressed, but to cope with stress a little bit. Community action, and this is where I would say the civil society organizations and the international organizations have a big role to play. Because them visiting the center, them talking to the immigrants would actually try to create some sort of real world connection rather than just seeing the guards or the staff work in detention. They also have an important role to play in monitoring, regular and independent. It has to be regular, it has to be independent. And it'll be better if there's a standardized evaluation tool, and there are a few. If you look at the next slide, so these are some of the aspects we can cover in an evaluation. This is a checklist. There's more information available in the report. But that is something the NGOs can work with. They could also work to provide painting sessions, sometimes just go and talk to them, psychosocial support. So there are various things the communities can engage in. Because it's also often I've seen that when communities engage, the conditions are often a bit more humane. So that's quite important. Develop personal skills. Here I'm actually referring more to about staff. It's important that they get the support and the training, because nobody's actually trained to work with migrants who are stressed in locked conditions. Often there is training to work in prison. Often there is training to work with people with mental distress, but not migrants in a locked environment who have not committed a crime. It's extremely important that the staff get right training at the right time and also support. And where required, detainees should also be provided support, how to address their stress factors. Appropriate healthcare, we discussed that before, I'm not going to go through it a bit more. It's important that healthcare staff are actually independent and autonomous, and this is actually communicated to the individuals in detention, because that is extremely important. And the care has to be need-based, not saying that everybody just go for a screening and nothing happens. It has to be based on the needs, because it's the state who locks them up. So then there lies the responsibility to make sure that they get the care they need. So, summary. Immigration detention has been increasing in this part of the world, but also globally quite a lot, and more and more money is being put into that. And it's important that this is actually used as a last resort and never for children. This is in line with international law. Before a measure for detention is considered, that's where the individual assessment comes into play. All non-custodial measures, including alternate detention, has to be sort of considered. And it is actually the health in detention, it's actually from a public health point of view, it's actually extremely important for the overall public health, not just in terms of communicable diseases, but also the disease burden. And it's also a human rights perspective, and I think it's actually quite valuable that we are actually discussing this in the Committee on Human Rights. I stop here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Suraj, for your presentation and to giving a bit broader perspective on the situation and about the reasons of detentions that we have, the increase of detained migrants, about especially the impact on the health, the mental health, that one of the key factors is the time period of detention, the preparedness of staff, and that these kind of things can be also be impacted by different types of stakeholder partners in our country. Tai aš kolegos dar norėčiau paprašyti.
Dear colleagues, do you have any questions for our keynote speaker? If you have a question, please raise your hand or turn on the microphone, introduce yourself, and put a question forward to Mr. Suraj.
A lot of shy people, to deliver for you a presentation. For me, maybe one question from my side can be that what you presented in the presentation, that one of the outcomes due to the detention and the health is the lack of trust in the country that the people are, with the staff, with the organizations that working around about the migrants. So maybe you can give some examples how even supporting in the practice this kind of staff, an example, to be more flexible, communicating with the migrants and these kind of things. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for the question, Vidas. Trust often takes time to build, and depending on the context we are talking about, sometimes individuals are detained for 7 days, sometimes for months or years. And it's the small things actually that matter. If you ask a question, so saying that I do not have this medicine, or I do not have this paper, whatever it might be, just how it is being responded. Staff are always busy. I've seen cases where I want to talk, I want to book an interpreter, and the staff actually missed to communicate that to and do the booking because they were busy. Just those small things actually make a big difference on how trustworthy the staff is. But also there is always going to be an element of mistrust because it's the government who is going to deport me, and the staff is from the government. But just to put the humane perspective, for example, staff having uniforms, always try to create that barrier, saying that, and often when I see that they have uniforms that looks like guard, again creating the prison-like structure. And it's in our human nature that this kind of trustworthiness is an issue. So language barrier is a big issue, how you communicate and how frequently you communicate, but also to make it clear, there is a law in the country where you live, whether you like it or not, and we have to follow it and communicating that. And that is the biggest challenge, I would say, the training the staff need. And if that is done, a lot of the mental health challenges in detention can be reduced, not removed, but can be reduced. So how to communicate to people from different culture using an interpreter. So as I said, 10-page decision just saying that this says you need to leave tomorrow. No, explain the context. There has been a procedure and this is how it has been done. As you know, you appeal 3 times, the decision is there, and now unfortunately you have to leave. For example, if you cooperate, you will get these kind of assistance. If you not, you don't, and these are your options. So take that time to discuss and actually to treat them as an individual, not as a prisoner. And I think that goes a long way in building trust, but also improving the condition.
Thank you, Suraj. And yeah, there was another. Sorry. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. That was a very interesting presentation. My name's Georgina. I'm from MSF. I'm the project coordinator. We've been working in Lithuania since last year. And it's very interesting what you're saying about the staff working in the detention areas and the training and support which is needed for them. And I think for a lot of them, they don't have the right skill sets and they don't have the right support. And this has been one of the big issues here. Obviously, as a medical humanitarian organization, we're very much focused on the health side. And we do see, especially now, with a lot of people being detained for more than 250 days, that there's a huge impact on their mental health and a big deterioration we're seeing. But in addition to everything you highlighted, there's also, of course, survivors of sexual violence and the survivors of torture who are very much ignored, I think, in the systems, and who do need specialized support. And we're finding, particularly for them, being detained as well is really exacerbating their conditions as well. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that as well. But yes, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you for the comment, and I fully agree. So one of the things which I did not discuss in the healthy policy, we say that it's the vulnerability screening. Before a person is detained, that's also where you see, like, if it's proportionate measure to detain individual who's already vulnerable. Victims of sexual violence is one of those categories. But that is what it says in the paper. But I also see in reality where that exists in the paper and there's a screening. but often that screening might happen many days after they're detained. So we have seen cases where young children are being detained with strange adults. What is the risk of anything happening there? So just having a vulnerability assessment, it's not enough. When and how and where that is being done and by whom, that is also an important criteria to be put in place. But thanks a lot for highlighting the issue.
Ar turime dar klausimą?
Are there any more questions? If not, I'd like to thank Suraj.
The answered questions. Ir dabar dar norėčiau pristatyti.
Let me now introduce to you Baptiste Amieux from the Regional Immigration and Border Management at IOM Brussels Regional Office. He's a specialist, and Mr. Baptiste Amieux will share his insights online, and he is going to speak about promising practices on alternatives to detention. So we will try to touch upon the instruments that help us with alternatives, how these alternatives might look like. And Mr. Amieux,
For interpreters, talking clearly and in the proper speed. So, Baptiste, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vidas, and I hope you can all hear me okay.
Yes, we can.
Okay, excellent. Thanks a lot and welcome and good morning, everybody. I'm sorry I cannot be here today. I wish I was in Vilnius with you all. I'm actually currently in Lisbon with our office in Portugal to actually discuss on alternative to detention. So that's clearly linked with our topic of today. So my name is Baptiste Amieux. I'm the regional thematic specialist on immigration and border management at our IOM regional office in Brussels, covering the European Economic Area. Just before I start, I would just want to say a few words. I'm sure Vidas has made the proper presentation of IOM and who we are, but in case not, but also to see where we place alternative to detention within our broader mandate. As you know, IOM, it's a we are a UN organization for now more than 6 years, and we have been existing for 72 years. In 2001, we were around 2,000 staff. Now we are 17,000 personnel in 500 offices with 174 member states, including, of course, Lithuania. We have, we do a lot of work that goes from assisting to voluntary return to migrants protection, resettlement, labor migration, community stabilization, disarmament, deradicalization, reintegration. And also we have this area of work which we call immigration border management, where we come in support to a member state in terms of border and identity authorities with capacity building mostly. And so we have offices everywhere in Europe where we also provide this support to our authorities. As part of within this mandate, we have our work on ATD. We are not, of course, working alone. I think as WHO highlighted it, and I think there is a number of partners that work on this, and I think it's very important that there is a lot of need on alternative detention, and we are not claiming that it is our own area of work. So I just wanted to give just a few words about IOM's background and our work on immigration border management. Today, a lot of it has been said already, so I don't want to take you too much through some of the key principles of ATD. I think our colleague from WHO has mentioned a few, and I think it's already quite clear to all of you. I will try to make it as practical as possible. Maybe it's going to be disappointing for you because maybe you were expecting that I will give you the perfect example or model of alternative to detention. I will not, because I think if there is one truth in ATD is that there is not one size fits all. I'm going to try to slow down a bit for the interpreter. I apologize. So yes, there is not one size fits all in ATD, and that's why I will try to give you a few examples, different contexts of countries. But again, it doesn't mean that this is applicable necessarily to Lithuania or not. Again, very classic definition of what is ATD to us, and I believe that's pretty much the same definition for everybody in the room. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this. again, IOMs, if you're more interested, because we are limited by the time today, I don't want to take you through too many things, but we have a few tools on alternatives to detention. And so you're welcome to access them on our publication website. And if you have an issue in accessing them, or if you want more information about how this can be turned into trainings and contextualized to your country, let us know. Again, this is something that was already mentioned, but I think it's very important to see that ATD is at different level. It is something that starts at a political level. I think we have mentioned that before in the previous presentations, but it is something that takes a political will and a political amendments, and then that gets translated at the legislative and policy level, which then has an impact on the case management and eventually on the detention itself. One thing I want to say here again is that we are a member state-led organization. We are not here to watch our member states or to be a surveillance organization. We're not here to say people should never be detained. We try to see whenever it's, as the colleague from the WHO mentioned, when can it be restrained to the strict minimum or to minimal cases. I think, and I will get back to that later on, because I know that some governments are worried about what their population might think if people are not detained. But there is also the financial aspect to it, where it actually costs a lot of money to detain people. While when you have alternative to detention with a proper case management, it gets way cheaper. And there are very interesting research about that from the International Detention Coalition. Again, the different elements of the ATD, which I just mentioned, the screen identification and decision making, options to live in the community, and limited restrictions. Those are several examples of ATDs, which again goes back to what I was mentioning. I think sometimes people make a confusion about ATD in the case of, okay, well, this organization is promoting ATD, meaning that this organization is saying that nobody should be detained and there shouldn't be any restriction of liberty or movement, which is not the case. We just say that there will be another solution so that we are respecting the legal decision of the country. We just think that there is a better option than just putting this person in a closed center. And I think for all of the reasons that were mentioned before in terms of the impact on the health, on the mental health, sometimes, towards dramatic results. And I'm not going to mention very bad example pointing fingers at countries, but we know that there were some really big dramas in detention in the recent years, including in Europe. So open and semi-centers are one option. You have quite a few in Europe and elsewhere. They happen to be quite efficient. Again, and I keep getting these questions. I visited a few detention centers recently in Slovenia and Portugal, where the main question is like, well, how do you mitigate the absconding risk? Well, first of all, depending on the country, and if you take Portugal as an example, and I'll get back to that. In Portugal, the administrative detention maximum administrative detention time is 60 days, which usually when there is an appeal from the migrant about the decision, it goes way beyond 60 days. And after 60 days, the person is set free. So we are just wondering, and we were brainstorming with the Portuguese, like what's the added value of keeping these people in a detained manner for 60 days for them releasing them anyway. So we try to, keep that, again, it's a country by country discussion, but it's just to give you an example. And now we are discussing the semi-open center or open centers with, of course, ways to an incentive for people to remain. So release with the obligation to register the place of residence. So that's one way of mitigating the absconding. Again, also another way is that most of these people, when they leave the mandatory detention time, they have no means, they have no financial means, they cannot move anymore, and they just want a place to stay, at least for some time. So they're usually keen to stay in a place that is given to them for residing. Obligation to report regularly to the authorities. That's very important. And it's also a way that can work quite well. Deposit of documents whenever there are documents. I agree that it's not always the case for migrants who are detained and that came irregularly. Relief with bail, round-trip guarantee or guarantor intervention, and designated residence or electronic monitoring, which is again something that can get quite extreme, but it's another way. So the benefit of ATD. I think I don't need to go beyond, because I think they were already mentioned, but they are very effective alternatives, and I think it's not something that are just theoretical. Again, I will mention a few concrete examples later on, but it does work, and we do have people that do not abscond, that we respect these rules, that do not create criminality because they're not detained. So, and again, cost effectiveness. I know that I don't want to make alternative detention a financial thing or a financial saving, but it's also true. And I know that for some countries where they were very they were fearing the reaction of the general public, it was also useful to play on the fact that it was actually very cost effective. They started with a pilot somewhere. It went quite well. There was no criminality coming with that, and so it reassured the general public. The partnership are essential. I mentioned that at the beginning. As IOM alone, we cannot do anything. I think the same for WHO, anyone else. I think it's really something where we need to rely on the local civil society. And in Portugal, for instance, we work very closely with JRS and Doctors of the World. We need to work with the government, because detention and the responsibility of releasing or detaining somebody is with the government, and this we need to respect that. So we need to work very closely. And again, I think from our side, we see that as a two-layer approach, where we do work in detention centers to mainstream human rights. So we have staff, for instance, in Porto, in the detention center, just to make sure that the detained people know their right, that they can talk to somebody in their language with cultural mediators that come from the same migration background, to reassure them about what's going to be the process. As the colleague from WHO mentioned, to explain to them very clearly, like what can they do, what's going to happen. Sometimes misunderstanding can lead to really dramatic decisions or actions. So like one side is to work inside detention as it is now, and the other side is like advocating for another model, which is more of a longer term aspect. So again, partnership are essential. The 5-step approach, again, that's the IOM's, that's the way we do work on ATD, and we do have a number of projects, let it be in Zambia, in Turkey, in Portugal, and other countries. But the baseline research, I think, this is something that the WHO colleague mentioned, but it's very important to better understand the detention landscape, the immigration detention landscape, the analysis of all the elements of the ATD, develop a national regional action plan. So again, that goes within the longer term approach. Do monitoring visit. I think this is usually also carried out very frequently by the Ombudsman office in the country. So work very closely with it. And then develop a tailored solution for the country. Again, we're not going to come and say, well, destroy your detention center, you don't need them anymore. People will just run with flowers in the air. No, let's try to find the most adapted approach to your national legislative framework and to your migratory and your irregular migration context. I will skip that because I will go through several examples, but just to show you like some countries where we have worked already: Thailand, Indonesia, Italy, Zambia, Belarus, and others, where, with different aspects of our mandate. So let it be from the case management aspect until the options in living in the community and organizing that. Some country example of ATD in the very broad sense of ATD. Again, ATD can be as far as doing some large regularization. here also, because the colleague from WHO mentioned, but COVID-19 has also like a, I would say, positive effect on detention in a way, or attempted to detention, because there were some decisions that were made immediately to prevent for the COVID-19 virus to spread even within detention. So they were actually decisions that were made to upscale detention facilities or premises or options. So there were some release. There were some immigration detention facilities that were emptied, and so that the people could be spread within the community, and so on. Canada, again, I will share this presentation afterwards. They have an interesting model where they have release on conditions, so like in-person reporting, cash deposit, or the establishment of a bondsperson. That goes back to the few examples I mentioned, with a national community case management and supervision program, and that helped to mitigate the risk of the people to abscond. But it's again one of the very good example that we have, and we usually we're infrequent, and there are a lot of peer-to-peer exchange between Canada and some of the countries on their model. Colombia, I mean, again, this is a regularization program, but a large amount of irregular migrants coming from Venezuela. There was an option to, I mean, technically and legally speaking, they should have gone to detention, if you wish. Obviously, Colombia was not able to detain 2 million people. So they rather launched a temporary regularization program. So it means that they were not all becoming like regular citizens in Colombia for a large amount of years, but for a temporary amount of year. And then it allowed actually to integrate them quite quickly within the society, but also to generate, an economic activity for the country. In Mexico, it was more targeted towards children. I think we mentioned before, the detention of child should not happen. And so in this case, Mexico made a legal move towards making this official and permanent. Portugal, I mentioned it actually, and this is why I'm here at the moment. There was also a temporary provisional regularization during COVID-19 with 356,000 immigrants, so that it would help them also to get access to social services and social and health services. And in Portugal now, as I was mentioning, we are having this discussion with the government about, okay, how we can find this alternative to detention. There are 2 detention centers in Portugal, which are in pretty good conditions, but we believe that, given the patterns and the profiles of irregular migrants in Portugal, there is no need to get these very strict and close facilities. So that's why we want to find an alternative, the decision, either like to live in the community, or as we are trying to actually advocate in Portugal, for a rather semi-open centers to start with, and then go towards open centers. I think it's very important to know that we can go slowly towards different solutions, starting with semi-open, see how it goes, then going towards open if there is a consensus. So I'm gonna stop here. I hope I was not too long. And again, my final words would be, one, it's not for IOM or anybody to tell Lithuania what is good, what is not, but it's rather to try to find a solution that is perfectly adapted to Lithuania or any other country. There are good practices that exist abroad that I think are good to go and see. But always remember that even if something works in Spain or in Greece or in Portugal, it doesn't mean it's going to work in Lithuania. I went myself to Prabate, for instance, and I think it was very good that the Lithuanian government decided to keep the family together and to allow them to go and live as they wish every day. I think that's a good practice of alternative to detention. And I think this is something you can try to adapt a bit more, to all the immigrants detained. And third, I think it is something that we have to work together on, and that you remain the persons in charge. And so we are here to support. So thank you very much. And I remain available for any questions.
Thank you, Baptiste, for your presentation. And I would say one of the takeaways that there is no perfect model, and there is one of the key issues to understand that if there is a political or a decision-making level, if there is an interest, and then to have the tailored approach how in each country these kind of alternatives to detention can be in place, and it also can help to find a balance, which was mentioned in the very beginning by the chairman of the committee, how to balance national security, human rights perspectives. So maybe this is the one of the tools to do that. So thank you, and I'm ready for the questions from the audience. Klausimai iš auditorijos. Yes, prašau prisistatyti.
Could you please introduce yourselves? Thank you for the opportunity to participate here. I'm an advisor here only, but I've worked as a judge for 5 years, and I know the pain, and I had the opportunity to confront with migrants. If you allow me, I will ask 2 questions, and I have one request. From my experience, I thank all the speakers. The information you've provided is very important, but what I want to say, in Lithuania we are faced with a situation where there are several phases of migrations. I agree with the chair of the committee that it is necessary to balance human rights and security, but we are facing a completely different situation. The cases that were considered by myself and my colleagues were related to detention and asylum rejection. But the situation in the last 2 days was different. We had 8 cases per day. So what are the questions that I have? We are speaking about the consequences, but we are not discussing the reasons and the causes. And the main cause to me is that migrants, I call them migrants, we had over 4,000 refugees, and only 150 asylum status were granted. Lithuania is not the country of destination of migrants. I had so many cases where only one person said that he wanted to stay in Lithuania, but the majority of migrants want to go to other countries. There were many cases where migrants say that they don't have passports or ID documents, where these documents had been taken in Minsk or near the border. So it is necessary to identify the person when they have no passports. I don't want to take your time because this migration crisis and the cases that are being considered by courts are very difficult. You've mentioned all the directives. So my question is to all the speakers. Do you see any positive perspective of the change of documents? Well, certainly it is difficult to change the conventions, but European directives could be changed so that if, for example, the situation objectively changes when there's such a great flow of migrants entering Lithuania, had we not prevented and detained people, we would see much larger flow to Lithuania, because we saw that people were entering Lithuania with large families. So one question is there a possibility of changing EU regulations? Now, speaking about court practice, the last cases in the EU Court of Human Rights, you mentioned that Lithuania is not seen in a very good light, but I do not agree with that, because judges and me personally went to Malta, where clear guidelines are given to judges, and judges consider the cases according to the guidelines. And the case that you mentioned in the Court of European Court of Justice, well, the situation was that persons entered Lithuania and they were caught in Poland. They did not make any applications for asylum. Could you please move to the specific question? So once again, is there any possibility to change legal regulation on the European level? And do you see any possibility of the change of court case law in the European Union? Thank you.
Another one is probably more to the Vladimir. Maybe you have some kind of insights on what was asked. So yeah, please, Baptiste, if you have something, and then Vladimir.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much. Thanks, Edvidas. I will try to bring. I think it's a hard question, and I'm hoping I got it well. So if I got it correctly, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the one of the question was whether what happens, because in the case of Lithuania, the people were coming to Lithuania or wanting to go elsewhere. So if we don't detain them in a closed facility, then they will leave immediately to another country. I think that was one of the question. Also, if there are no strict detention, it's going to be a pull factor. So I think those were a bit the questions, and maybe I missed the rest, but I'm sorry. So I think, again, I'm not saying, I'm going back to what I was mentioning. We're not mentioning that every single migrant in Lithuania should be free. I mean, irregular migrants should be free of their movement and can walk wherever they want and then continue their road towards Lithuania. I think it's a case by case story. And I think you're working for the justice. I mean, I guess if I understood correctly, you're a judge. And that's actually where your function is essential in assessing exactly on a case by case basis who can actually be not detained, and with different measures for alternative to detention. And I think that's where you see like cases where there is no risk at all that this person would leave, or very little risk. There is never a zero risk policy. But I think, if you see a family with young children that are quite desperate, they're vulnerable, they're in Pravate, for instance, and you just want to let them living in the community in Pravate, I think, this is one of the cases where you could think, well, they don't represent a risk for the society. They do not necessarily want to continue their road, and we don't think that there is a risk that they would migrate irregularly to another country. So that's the type of thing. I don't think that detention is actually really very much working as a factor that decreases migration or irregular migration, to be honest. So I'm not sure that alternative to detention will bring people to Lithuania because they can live a nice detention. I don't think that it's a push factor. So yeah, I think that would be my elements. Again, I think, and for example, in Portugal, we're working with the judges to train them and to give them more information about alternative to detention and migration, about the different profiles. Because again, most of these irregular migrants are not a substantial risk for the society. But I will, maybe if other colleagues in the panel wants to intervene.
Okay, thank you, Baptist. Vladimir.
I will try to answer your questions. Speaking about the conventions and directives, conventions cannot be amended. There's no process of amending or changing conventions. We hear certain politicians in different countries say whether we should change or amend the Convention on Human Rights, the Convention of Refugees, but conventions are effective and no proposal on amendments are being considered. Speaking about the directive, yes, we know that several years ago the European Commission has proposed the Asylum Pact, and that the current directives should be amended and changed. Colleagues from the EU might know the process, but the question is how to change and what should be changed. Speaking about the directives, we should define the border procedure, which would be the essential element that would let countries implement their commitments to accept people and to investigate their claims or their applications. And the essential question is, what is the size and the level of restrictions is possible in terms of detention? Speaking about the case law, I think that the situation is quite complicated and it is difficult to assess whether case law is should be changed. Well, the last cases against Hungary showed that Article 5 of the EU Convention was violated when families lived in the transit area for several months. So these were very similar to the camps that we had in Lithuania. So what families, vulnerable families, lived in such conditions. But we know the Ilyas and Ahmed case where people lived in such conditions for 20 days and the court stated that there were no violations. So it is all depending on any individual case. Thank you.
Just want to give a short example because I'm not a legal expert and I guess EU laws could be changed. It's happening, but I don't think the issue is the law because all EU countries follow the same regulations and directives, but the practices are completely different. For example, some countries based on the written directive, it says the maximum is 18 months to detain a person. Some countries do that. Some countries in their national laws have transposed to 6 months or lesser than that. So it's up to the countries how we see how it is different. So while laws could be changed, it's how they are being transposed make the difference. EU as an example has the same directives and regulations, but see varying practices. So just from a non-legal perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. So we are quite short of time. Baptiste, I don't know if you have some time to stay here, and I would like also to invite other colleagues, starting with Erika Leonaitė, Seimo kontrolierių įstaigos vadovė.
Head of the Seimas Ombudsperson's Office, to join our discussion. and to give your own perspective on this situation related to detention of migrants in Lithuania. Thank you. I'm not an expert on migration, and I feel a bit uneasy in such a discussion among specialists and experts. But my remarks are related to our institution and to the standpoint of our institution. It is obvious that last year and until summer this year, detention was made as a choice. There were certain circumstances that led to that, and there were several circumstances leading to that. First of all, we faced instrumentalized migration. It is not easy to deter the regime that uses people, instrumentalizes people, and opens the ways of migration into Lithuania. And we've changed this target of aggression from the aggressor to the people. And it led to the decisions that finally resulted in automatic long-term detention in quite difficult conditions, which has been determined already. And I think that this is a problem, that we confuse those things and we did not leave any space for case-to-case basis, which has been mentioned repeatedly in today's roundtable discussion. The rhetoric and associations with national security demonstrated that the society had great expectations of detention and deterrence measures, and this also made effect on the decision by politicians. We also had the EU resources helping us, and therefore this detention practice was not costly for us. On the other hand, in terms of the problems, from the standpoint of human rights, include material conditions. Well, they have been improved, but there were many uncertainties, lack of information to people. We still receive complaints that people are not informed about the decisions that are related to them, that they are given the documents, but not all the people are well educated to comprehend those decisions. Therefore, the regulation of detention formally, we had this real detention according to the level. Our accommodation was equal to detention. So lack of legal aid. Very often it was only on paper, so we saw challenges that were related with disproportionate use of force, inability to protect from sexual abuse, and all the circumstances that were shared by people working in detention centers. Health issues, mental health issues. We saw people that were depressive, that felt this first they were hopeful, and later on we could see hopelessness in their eyes. In terms of human rights, this was a complicated situation, but when we ask what have we achieved, the chair of the committee noticed correctly that finally many people once received the possibility absconded, and some people say that alternatives were not effective, but I can say that alternatives were not applied. But in order to make the alternatives effective, information has to be properly provided for people. Legal aid should be properly ensured to people from the very initial stages. Now we see the situation where people are confined in these conditions for 1 year, and later on they're just released. And so this is only logical that we were not able to expect any other results. And maybe there was some secret intention to make them abscond. But if the objective of those strict measures was to prevent Lithuania becoming the country of transit and to make it a deterrence measure for potential migrants, prevent them from entering Lithuania from Belarus, we have not achieved positive results that we had, but we live in this situation where we had really very many problems in terms of human rights. Speaking about the deterrence itself, it is difficult to say how much this deterrence policy is effective when we have the pushback policy. Foreign studies show that there's no correlation between the detention and irregular border crossing. Therefore, it is time to speak about alternatives to detention, and political will is needed for that. We need the strategy and preparation. We had deterrence and detention first and foremost in that situation. It was not in line with international commitments, but we have to draw a 3-lane system and to ensure that the primary screening should not be seen as the necessity for detention, especially for vulnerable populations such as children, pregnant women, elderly people, or, for example, victims of torture, victims of abuse. Children. We had situations when children were in detention conditions for a long duration, and according to international standards, this is unacceptable. Therefore, we should think of a separate lane regime, and to think about the possibility of having case management, which has very great importance on the effectiveness of alternative to detention measures. If we speak about the situation when we give resources to detention, to protection, but we see that this should be the last resort. And this also has to be in line with so many criteria to be not in conflict with the international standards. Therefore, such resources that are allocated to detention could be allocated to alternatives. And this would be much more cost effective. We should not also depend only on NGOs, and I very much hope that today's discussion is the very beginning where we will finally see the changes. Thank you, Erika. We have 3 minutes until our formal end time. We will also give the floor to Eglė Samuchovaitė and Dainius Pūras. Now, I would like to give the floor to Eglė Samuchovaitė, head of the Refugee and Migrant Program at the Lithuanian Red Cross.
Thank you for the opportunity to share the insights of the Red Cross. I believe that much has already been said. I'm not going to compete in legal knowledge with Mr. Vladimir Samuchovas, and I do agree that I am not an expert in legal things. So I'm not going to repeat the things that have been mentioned by the head of the Sabas Ombudsperson's office and other keynote speakers, is that when last year we had an influx of migrants, there were no case management examples in Lithuania. I'm not going to mention other problematic aspects that have been mentioned previously. Now, to answer the question whether there are any alternatives to detention, the question of our roundtable discussion, we had 3 things that we could do with migrants. We had the opportunity not to detain them, because there were minor people, vulnerable people, and other people who could be subject to alternatives to detention. For example, we could offer them the possibility to live in the place where, let's say, they have chosen. And if people who had financial resources and express their will to, let's say, find accommodation in the community, we could have provided for that. Unfortunately, we did not do that. Also, we also provided the opportunity we could have provided the opportunity for people to come back to their service. Now, when it comes to the choices that Lithuania have made, was the detention of everyone. We don't have the resources to analyze all the situations individually. That was being said, because our government did not know what to do with the people later on. I know that when accommodating people, we provided them with accommodations either in detention centers or in some old schools. But I think that we could have done better if we hadn't chosen to detain them, because having detained them, we were not able to provide them all the social and medical services. And once we failed to provide them with such services, we violated international law and human rights. So we did have the measures, but we did not put them in practice. I have listened to the arguments during this discussion. I think there are 2 major arguments, and one of the arguments is resources. Because once you start to apply the procedures, or you have to analyze the situation, you have to think of the resources. Because previously we used to have from 10 to 20 migrants, and the year before, the number of migrants exceeded 4,000. That's why Lithuania decided to impose to adopt the deterrence policy. One might argue whether deterrence measures were in line with international law and in line with human rights. I believe that the key question that the state has to address is to... I don't think that this is the last crisis, by the way. I don't think that this is the last influx of migrants that we have received. The question for the state has to be how fast it can allocate the resources, how fast it can build its capacities to accept all the influx of migrants. I don't think that Lithuania has utilized all the possibilities available. We also had the support from the World Health Organization, and I do understand how difficult it is to find time to cooperate with external partners, because our organization faced similar problems. We also received representatives with a wealth of experience. Unfortunately, in times of crisis, we failed to find the time to talk to them, to discuss to them, to hear their examples of best practice, and to translate the best practices into reality. So, to my opinion, looking to the future, we should not only establish the institution responsible for accommodation of migrants, we also have to think how to allocate the necessary funding in the fastest possible way and to make them available for use. I would also like to touch upon yet another important thing when it comes to receiving refugees from Ukraine. I remember the Canadian colleague once said that countries receiving refugees very soon realize what problems their countries and their citizens face. So now the same is with Lithuania. The reception of Ukrainian refugees have also revealed several problems. Unfortunately, our society tends to say that Lithuanian people do not get the necessary services, therefore we should not be focusing on Ukrainian refugees, but I don't think that is a valid argument. We should think of how to improve the situation, not only for migrants, but also for our own nationals. I'll finish at that. Thank you, Eglė Samuchovaitė, for your conclusions and for your insights. And now, let me give the floor to Professor Dr. Dainius Pūras, who is the director of the Human Rights Monitoring Institute, and I believe he will share his wonderful insights with us. Thank you. First and foremost, let me thank you for this meaningful discussion. I don't think that the discussion is taking place too late. I represent the non-governmental organizations like the Human Rights Monitoring Institute and other institutes that are dealing with human rights and who have the duty to inform of the negative impact and of the negative consequences. So today, we are discussing the alternatives to detention, and detention was that negative impact that we have heard and we have talked a lot during the previous years. But as we know, the official rhetorics, the migration management is perceived as a good thing. Our government boasts that it has dealt very well with the migration crisis, and I see a problem here because the government fails to self-criticize itself. I know that this migration management has brought negative effects both to Lithuanian reputation and to the psychological health of our society. I'm not going to repeat others. because previous speakers have already spoke of the negative consequences of detention on migration, especially when the detention is a long-term one, and especially when people are detained in conditions that are degrading to their human dignity. Speakers have also talked about detention conditions for children. Well, I do agree that we can say that migration influx took us by surprise, and the deterrence strategy was to show the migrants that Lithuania is the state that is not to be chosen for migration in the future. So my question is whether we want to change the reputation of Lithuania, and I am sure that the consequences, the negative consequences, will be not only on the migrants that have crossed the Lithuanian, of Lithuania, but also on the physical health of the wider society, because what our society heard was that the people who are crossing the border are dangerous for our society, despite the fact that migrants did not commit any crimes. I was in the north of Lithuania that summer, and I know, I've heard from them directly, that the communities there were very much afraid of the migrants. They demanded that government gave them some self-protection measures, and this increased the xenophobic attitudes towards migrants. And due to the public narrative, quite a lot of people in Lithuania became very strict with regard to accommodating migrants in their neighborhoods. Although we have rehabilitated ourselves when we have admitted a lot of Ukrainian refugees, but that does not help to improve our reputation as a xenophobic country, because everyone thinks that in the long-term perspective, we will only allow access to people who are close to us in cultural or other aspects. Therefore, my question is whether we have time to rethink what has been done by us, and whether we have any opportunities to pursue the balance. I do not deny any threats to our national security, but the fact is that we have denied migrants their human rights. And I am talking here about our international reputation. And it seems that Lithuania have become very similar to autocratic regimes because of its rhetoric towards migrants. We do talk a lot about international law, but we want to deny international law when it comes to Lithuania. But I believe that the selective approach is dominant in such countries as the Russian Federation or China, rather than a democratic country. We can't say that European institutions or international institutions should refrain from interfering. Unfortunately, This has been mentioned quite a lot by our public officials. To conclude, I'm very happy to have heard of the best practices of detention, of alternatives to detention. So I hope that there will be a breakthrough in Lithuania and we will undertake to use those alternatives to detention. Because just to remind you, Lithuania a few years ago tried to take the best practice of Hungary, which was very heavily criticized by the EU and by various international organizations. So I don't think that we should learn from such countries as Hungary. We should learn from some other best examples and to reassess the situation once again. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Puras. I would like to thank all the keynote speakers and the participants of the conference. We will share the slides with everyone. I hope that this will not be a problem. The recording of the event will also be available. As I have mentioned, the discussion is broadcast online. I would also like to thank our interpreters who have contributed to our work. Thank you very much. And to conclude, I think that alternatives to detention, on the one hand, might sound very mystical, and one might think whether we need any alternatives to detention. But as the chair of the Committee on Human Rights said in his welcome address, the recent year in Lithuania was very different from the perspective of migration. We have much to learn. And this goes about the future. We have to learn a lot. We have to scale up our capacities and we have to get ready for the uncertainty. We can learn from the experiences of other countries and to balance both our security interests and migration aspects. Today, before the event, I looked into my notebook and I am sure that all this discussion that might seem rather cold and rather conceptual have people behind them, because behind every discussion there is someone's father, someone's mother, and someone's child. So I hope that we will not forget all the people and all those geopolitical aspects. And I invite you to share the insights, if you want, with me personally or in the group, but with no interpretation provided, because interpreters are already leaving.
Tyla, gerai, tai galim vieni kitiems savo pasiploti.
Thank you very much.